There was a time when there wasn't a video game industry. Instead, it was a video game kingdom. A kingdom ruled by one. And that king was Nintendo. And while Nintendo had a dominant role, there were some that sought to unseat the king. And one of those was the Sega. This is the story of the Sega Genesis, also known as the Mega Drive. See, one did not just simply play video games. One used to play Nintendo.
One does not simply walk into Mordor.
And this is the world that the Sega was competing in. A leader in the arcade industry, Sega felt it had claim to the throne. And they decided to claim that with their 5th try at a console. Yes, the Sega Genesis, also known as the Mega Drive, was Sega's 5th attempt at trying to get a little bit of the console market. Sega tried to unseat the king with their failing 8-bit Master System, but it was pretty much a failure everywhere. So a few individuals got together for their next project. In order to unseat the king, they needed a weapon, a powerful weapon, and they decided they would pull out all the stops. The Sega Genesis was codenamed Project Mark V. This was a reference to their 5th attempt at creating a console to fight the Nintendo overlord. They wanted to pull out all the stops with this one, and they did have a secret weapon in the system. That secret weapon was their powerful arcade board, the System 16. Leading the project for the Mark V was Hideki Sato, and one of the lead engineers was Masamami Ishikawa. These two helped pioneer this system with its secret weapon. Sega at the time may have not been leading in any kind of console wars, but they did have a strong grasp in the arcade market. So the team leading the Project Mark V used arcade DNA as their secret weapon. Inside of this console is a chip based off of their System 16 board, which was found in a lot of their arcade platforms. That System 16 board was powered by a Motorola 68000, a very powerful chip. It was also used in another familiar piece of tech that was popular in the 1980s, the Apple Macintosh. Yes, the same chip in the Apple Macintosh is inside of the Sega Genesis. Now, if you weren't around in the 1980s or the early 90s to see what the arcade scene looked like, you might not understand how big of a fact having an arcade-powered chipset inside of a video game console would be. And I mean, this makes perfect sense. Sega knew they had a great system with hundreds of thousands of teens playing on it, so they just take that and stick it inside here. Well, then you could bring hits like Golden Axe and Shinobi from the arcade directly inside the home. It sounds like a win-win situation. There's a few problems here. One, the design of an arcade is a lot bigger than Sega Genesis. And the other thing is the cost. In fact, in order to put the 68,000 chip in here, Sega made a bet, a really big bet. In fact, in order to get the cost down, Sega had to make a large upfront gamble to buy huge purchase orders of these chips. So if they didn't sell the Sega, they were going to be out of a lot of money. But they managed to do it. After prototype and after prototype, they got an arcade into a console no bigger than a dinner plate. So after getting that powerful chip inside of here, it was obvious that Sega would dominate, right? I mean, at the time of launch, There was no Super Nintendo quite yet, right? Well, actually, this console flopped, and it flopped hard in Japan.
Mario!
It was partly crushed so bad due to the release of Super Mario 3. In fact, a lot of people just didn't see a reason to get a new console. So they came up with a new plan. That new plan was to take the Mega Drive over across the Pacific to America. And when it got to America, the CEO of Sega America, David Rawson, had an idea for the Mega Drive. He thought that the Sega needed a new beginning, a new reputation, a Genesis of sorts when coming to America. And that's exactly what happened. In America, we got the Sega Genesis. Sega America also brought a new sheriff into town, and that sheriff was Michael Katz. Michael Katz had a two-part plan. The first thing was to directly challenge the Nintendo for its throne, and that included new slogans like Genesis does what Nintendon't. Almost as brash as the 80s were themselves.
What Nintendon't.
But he also had another plan besides just some branding. He decided that Sega needed a new mascot. A mascot that could go head to head with Mario and come bundled with the game. So enter Altered Beast. Yeah. He had the right plan. Sega definitely needed a new mascot, but that wasn't quite it. Sega needed a new star, something that could really compete with Mario. Enter the Blue Blur, a sassy teenage-like character that sped across your screen. That's right, Sonic the Hedgehog. I know you guys were waiting for it. But there was one problem with bringing Sonic on as a mascot. Nobody knew who he was. And there was only one way to really get the message out. And that was to bundle the game with the Genesis. Now, when this came to the board, it was a bit of a problem. The reason being is that, well, Sonic was anticipated to be a really big game. And if you gave your game away for free with the Genesis, well, you'd lose out on revenue. After a lot of poking and prodding, they were eventually given the okay to bundle the Sega with the Sonic game. And boy, was it the right choice. Sonic would eventually become a household name. He'd get his own cartoon show, and eventually he'd go on to get a few highly successful movies. After a few changes, actually.
It's called Ugly Sonic, Uglier Crimes.
So when Sonic hit the scene in 1991, bundled with the Sega Genesis, it was an explosion. In fact, most people didn't know the Sega existed until they heard about Sonic. With the Sonic now becoming bundled with the Genesis, the console wars were officially on. One other big thing that Sega thought was really important was to bundle each game with the Sega chant. Yeah, I can still hear it today. Now, what's really interesting about that is that sound and image took up almost an eighth of the entire cartridge. But it was worth having the memorable name. Now, we can't talk console wars without talking a little bit about the stats. And well, it was a race. See, when it came to processing power, the Sega won, no doubt about it. Its processor packed 7.5 megahertz of speed. That almost doubled the 3.56 found on the Super Nintendo. and it absolutely decimated the Nintendo's 1.7. So when it came to processing power, Sega could handle it. It allowed it to have its super fast Sonic games as well as some sports titles that just weren't as great on the Super Nintendo. The next stat we need to talk about is RAM. And well, the Sega came in with 64, but the Super Nintendo doubled that. So we're going to give processing power to the Sega, and Super Nintendo is going to get it on the RAM. But where Super Nintendo really had an edge was its color palette. It featured a rich color palette of over 30,000 colors available. Meanwhile, the Sega, well, it only had a little over 500. So that meant the Super Nintendo had extremely bright and vibrant games, while the Sega was dark and gritty. But I think Sega kind of ran with it, because with games like Mortal Champions and Comic Zone, well, it played into the darker, edgier scene. They also had bigger cartridges on the Super Nintendo, which meant role-playing games could have deeper menus and slightly better stories. Now let's take a moment to focus on the Sega Genesis cartridges. Specifically, I'd like to talk about a little company, well, at least at the time, called Electronic Arts. Trip Hawkins founded Electronic Arts after leaving Apple. And when he came over, he wanted to make sure that his developers felt like rock stars. So he called them software artists. One thing he knew, though, is that he could not stand Nintendo's draconian royalty and licensing fees with their cartridges. So when looking at making games for the Sega, he decided he would get completely around them. And that plan was to reverse engineer Sega cartridges. And his team did just that. After reverse engineering the cartridges, Trip Hawkins went to Sega and said, hey, we need to make a new deal. After a little bit of discussion, he walked out there with a reduced royalty program and the ability to make his own cartridges. And when he started making his cartridges, he decided to make them a little bit taller and add a yellow tab, thus launching EA Sports as we know it. Now, with Electronic Arts and Sonic under its belt, there was one more game that helped make the Sega stand out from the Super Nintendo. And it was a game that they both had. Enter Mortal Kombat. For the Super Nintendo, Nintendo absolutely refused to let the blood and gore go uncensored. Meanwhile, Sega played right into it. Teenagers all over America started entering the famous combinations to unlock a fatality, completely uncensored on the Sega Genesis. This also led to the first ever rating system for video games. So I guess, thank you, Mortal Kombat. But hey, it really helped build into Sega's role as an edgier, more teen-friendly console. Now at this point, Sega's rocking and rolling. The console wars are at full tilt. How could they lose? Now at this point, Sega has a long series of games to directly fight against the Super Nintendo. In fact, Sega's kind of winning, at least in America, and it looks like they have a chance. By 1993, Sega had a real shot at the throne. In fact, they had a larger share of the market, at least in America. So they could only go up from here, right?
Oh, geez.
Enter brand confusion. After gaining a lot of the market, Sega started having add-ons. In fact, they came out with the Sega CD. Yes, that's right. In the early 90s, we had the Sega CD. If you didn't hear about it, don't worry, a lot of people didn't. And that's okay. To be honest, Sega's downfall was as much as their own as any. They didn't really know how to drive the brand.
This is great. You're doing amazing.
Nintendo was focused on building great games with great fan bases, while Sega was focused on building new technology and creating add-ons. And this kind of created some confusion. If Sega was building new games, was I going to be able to play them? Did I need new hardware to do it? And with the release of the Sega CD, it was dominated not by an add-on from Super Nintendo, but a new game, Donkey Kong Country. It released with 3D-like graphics, and it played awesome. And soon, people started to forget about Sega. And at this point, Sega wasn't only battling the Super Nintendo. Now, depending on where you look, the downfall of Sega came from a few different places. But it seems like some of that may have been a battle between Japan and America. Well, not between Japan and America, but Sega Japan and Sega America. Now, I can't really suss out the truth to all of this, but it does make sense because, at least in America, Sega was a bit of a hit, and it was a bit of a nothing burger when we look at Japan. So it stands to reasons that there were some differences between each side. Some say the downfall of Sega actually came from accounting. Well, see, for Sega, their biggest seller was in the Americas. And at some point, the yen started to become more valuable than the dollar. So that meant Sony would take losses on some games when they transferred the value back over to the yen. At the end of the day, Sega came really close to taking the throne, but they just didn't have the sticking power they needed. Now, what really caused their downfall, I'm not sure. But what I can tell you is that Super Nintendo stayed faithful to what it was. It always made sure to stay loyal to the games it made, and it was very consistent. Meanwhile, the Sega was anything but consistent. And sometimes in war, slow and steady wins the race. But that's not the last console war we'll ever see. In fact, hopefully we can talk about more of them in a more in-depth way on this channel. Hopefully you've liked what you heard and can give me some tips on things I can do. Thank you for checking out the video, and I look forward to seeing you again. Please take a chance to like and subscribe and give me some suggestions in the comments on what you'd like to see. And also drop some comments on your favorite console ever. Well, thanks for taking the time, and I'll see you later on Tecked Out.